It all started with something seemingly ordinary. My wife had some unresolved legal matters hanging over her for a while. They weren't urgent, but they still needed attention. She mentioned to me one evening that her friend, a lawyer, was returning from vacation the following week. Apparently, as soon as her friend arrived, they planned to have what she called a girls' consultation. I raised an eyebrow and asked what that entailed. She said they'd likely head to a cafe, spread out the documents, and go over everything together. I shrugged. It made sense. I told her that was good timing because I'd been planning to fully disassemble and clean the engine on my car. I figured I'd invite my dad over, crack open a couple of beers, and make a day of it. She smiled, said she was glad I wouldn't just be lounging around doing nothing, and that was that. That evening, I decided to sit down with my laptop to order the car parts one needed. She was on the couch, watching a movie. As I opened the browser, I noticed something odd in the search history, a dictionary of basic legal terms. I turned to her and asked, "Do you really need to brush up on legal terminology for your meeting with your friend?" She nodded without hesitation and said, "Yes, of course." I didn't want to look clueless, so I went through some basics. It seemed plausible enough. I didn't think much of it and went back to browsing engine parts. The day her friend was supposed to return arrived. I woke up early, not from my alarm, but because of the noise coming from our bedroom. My wife was rushing around, clearly in a hurry. She was dressed in a black knee-length skirt and a crisp white blouse, an outfit that looked more corporate than casual. It reminded me of scenes from TV shows about high-powered office meetings. She noticed I was awake and quickly said, "I have to run, I'm already late." Before I could ask anything else, she was out the door. I decided not to dwell on it and instead called my father to confirm our plans. A little later, he arrived, and we set to work on the engine. It felt good to be busy with something tangible, something that made sense. Midway through our work, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my wife, a photo. The image showed a cluttered cafe table covered with papers, folders, and scattered notes. But one thing caught my eye immediately. The corner of the image had the edge of a pair of men's trousers. Someone was sitting next to her. I frowned. She had been pretty clear about it just being her and her friend. I showed my father the photo, and he just shrugged. "Could be anyone," he said, and went back to fiddling with the engine. He wasn't wrong. It could have been anyone. But it still nagged at me. I decided not to jump to conclusions and told myself I'd ask her about it when she got home. We finished working on the engine later that afternoon, and by evening my wife returned home. She seemed relaxed, even cheerful. I let her settle in and talk about her day without interrupting. After a while, I casually brought up the photo. "Who was sitting next to you in the cafe?" I asked. She looked confused and said, "What are you talking about?" I explained what I had seen in the photo, the edge of the trousers. She laughed lightly and said, "Oh, that." The cafe was absolutely packed. It's one of those trendy Instagram places, and we could barely find a table. A family was sitting next to us, and the father couldn't fit comfortably at their table, so he sat beside me instead. She then pulled out her phone and showed me another photo, one she had taken from a wider angle. The cafe was indeed packed to the brim with people. Tables crammed together, servers squeezing through narrow aisles. It looked chaotic. She wasn't lying about the place being overcrowded. I nodded and said, "Okay, makes sense." But something still didn't sit quite right. After she went to shower, I noticed the folder she had brought back with her sitting on the kitchen table. I couldn't resist. I opened it and leafed through the documents. To my surprise, they were mostly blank templates, standard forms with placeholders and instructions. There were no notes, no filled-in sections, nothing that indicated hours of work had gone into them. Later that night, I asked her, "If you spent the whole day working, why are these documents blank?" She didn't flinch. "My friend gave me those templates to study," she said. She told me to get familiar with them before we move forward. The filled-in one stayed with her. She then pulled out her phone again and showed me another picture, This time, it was a close-up of the filled-in documents. I stared at the image, trying to make sense of the legal jargon, but honestly, it was incomprehensible to me. Legal documents always looked like some cryptic code. Lawyers are like translators between normal people and the law, she joked as she closed her phone. The explanation sounded reasonable. Everything seemed to add up, even if the unease in my chest hadn't fully disappeared. She picked up the folder, tucked it under her arm, and said she had things to do. As she walked out of the room, I realized I had nothing else to ask. Everything she said made sense, and yet, there was still something there, something intangible, that I couldn't quite put my finger on. But I let it go. At least for now. The next morning, I found myself glancing at her folder again while sipping my coffee. I couldn't stop wondering about those documents, the cafe, and the photo. But life went on, and I pushed it to the back of my mind. For now, at least. The weekend finally arrived after what felt like an endless week at work. My office had been consumed by a massive project, and as usual, the heavy lifting fell on the shoulders of those who actually got things done. I barely saw home during the week, and when I did, it was only to catch a few hours of sleep before diving back into the chaos. By the time I walked through the door that Saturday, I was ready to unwind. But as I entered, I noticed my wife was already halfway dressed, carefully selecting her accessories in front of the mirror. She was putting more effort into her outfit than usual. Naturally, I asked where she was headed. Without missing a beat, she explained that her mother had called her earlier in the day with an invitation for a little outing. According to my wife, her mom, now in her later years, had always dreamed of dressing elegantly and strolling through the charming streets of the city. Apparently, her father was tied up with home repairs, so her mother decided to seize the day and invited my wife along. My wife described it in a way that made it sound completely innocent, even sweet. She even showed me a picture her mother had sent, an older woman in a lovely pastel outfit, beaming at the camera. I nodded and let her go about her plans. If anything, it gave me an opportunity to have a bit of time for myself. I had a stash of homemade cutlets in the fridge, a case of beer, and a few friends who could be convinced to swing by for an impromptu gathering. A quick round of texts later, plans were set in motion. One of my friends even promised to bring a bottle of expensive whiskey. The evening shaped up nicely, and I figured my wife would be back in time to join us for a drink or two. Hours passed in good company. The cutlets were devoured, the whiskey opened, and the evening air was filled with the sounds of casual laughter and relaxed conversation. At one point, my phone buzzed with a message from my wife. It was a selfie of her and her mother, both smiling at a cozy restaurant table. The image settled any passing doubts I might have had, and I poured myself another drink, content with how the evening was unfolding. Eventually, I heard the faint sound of a car engine pulling into the driveway. It was late, and most of the guys had started to wind down. I excused myself and walked out to meet her. Old habits die hard. I spent a few years in law enforcement, and those instincts never really leave you. Playfully, I stepped in front of her car as she slowed down near the driveway. She rolled to a stop, and I approached, grinning. But then I noticed something odd. The passenger seat was covered in dried mud, large, uneven patches as though someone with heavy boots had been sitting there. My wife's mother, as lovely as she looked in that earlier picture, was not the type to track mud around. Both she and my wife were always meticulously clean, almost obsessively so. Something about those muddy marks didn't sit right. She stepped out of the car, cheerful as ever, and greeted me with a wide smile. Before I could ask anything, I told her to join the guys out back. They were still polishing off the last of the food. She didn't hesitate, practically skipping towards the back patio. I stood by the car for a moment longer, the faint smell of cheap cologne lingering in the cool evening air. I opened the passenger door and leaned in. The scent was unmistakable, stale and synthetic, something that clashed heavily with the clean floral perfume my wife usually wore. The mud was crusted deep into the mat, uneven and splattered as though someone had been sitting there for quite a while. I ran my hand over the seat, but aside from the mud and the smell, there wasn't much else to find. After a few minutes of inspecting, I decided it wasn't worth dwelling on just yet. I shut the car door and headed to the back of the house, where my wife was already entertaining the guests with some story. Her laughter carried through the evening air, and she seemed completely at ease. As the night wore on, the group began to thin out. One by one, my friends said their goodbyes, and eventually, it was just me and my wife left in the quiet glow of the patio lights. I leaned back in my chair, sipping the last of my beer, and casually brought up the mud. "So, did your mom trade her heels for hiking boots halfway through your outing?" I asked with a smirk. She paused, blinked, and then let out a small laugh. "Oh, that." On the way back, there was a soldier on the roadside, waving down cars. Nobody stopped, but I did. He told me his phone had died, and he needed to call a taxi. So I gave him a ride. He'd just gotten back from somewhere. I didn't ask too many questions. The explanation seemed plausible enough. Soldiers aren't exactly known for wearing pristine footwear, and the smell of cologne, well, who's to say what brands they have access to? I nodded, shrugged, and told her she'd done a good deed. We stayed out on the patio a little longer, finishing the last of the food. The night air had turned crisp, and the hum of distant traffic was the only sound breaking the silence. My wife stretched, let out a contented sigh, and mentioned that she had a packed schedule for the coming week. "You're going to be so bored without me around," she said with a playful grin. We cleared the table, rinsed the dishes, and eventually made our way to bed. As I lay there in the dark, I found myself replaying the day in my mind, the mud, the cologne, the soldier. Everything fit together neatly enough, yet a faint itch of doubt remained. But for now, it was enough. We turned off the lights, and sleep came quickly. Whatever questions lingered could wait for another day. The day started off uneventfully, the kind of quiet normalcy that I had started to appreciate lately. I was sipping my coffee and scrolling through my phone when my wife's ringtone suddenly cut through the calm. She answered immediately, her voice soft and sympathetic. I could only hear fragments of her conversation, but the way she kept saying, "Oh no, that's awful, and I'm so sorry," made me sit up straighter. My first thought was that someone had died. I raised my eyebrows, silently asking her what had happened, but she just shook her head, signaling for me to wait. As the call continued, she began moving around the room, pulling a dress from the closet and starting her makeup routine. It wasn't hurried, she was focused, deliberate. When the call ended, I asked her directly what was going on. She sighed and explained that her friend's child had fallen sick and her friend had begged her to cover a night shift at the office. Apparently, the friend was desperate and my wife couldn't say no. I frowned and asked if her office even operated at night. I had always assumed the place shut down after regular hours. She quickly reassured me, saying that night shifts were rare but not unheard of. Some people even pulled all-nighters at their desks, she said. IT workers, in particular, apparently thrived in those odd hours. She mentioned one guy, chubby, socially awkward, who was practically nocturnal. I made a light joke about her now joining the ranks of those nocturnal creatures, but she didn't laugh. Instead, she told me that the office had its own rhythm at night, a different vibe altogether. She then added, somewhat sternly, that she always wanted to look presentable, no matter the time of day or who was around. "I might look like a mess in front of you," she said, "but not in front of others." It was her final word on the matter. She grabbed her purse and keys and walked out the door. The night felt longer than usual. I tried to distract myself, watched a movie, scrolled through social media, but I couldn't shake a vague sense of unease. At around 2 a.m., sleep completely evaded me. On impulse, I picked up my phone and called her. No answer. A moment later, a message popped up instead. She said she couldn't talk because one of the IT guys was fixing the server, and she needed to wait until he was done to send out some documents. I leaned back in my chair, rereading the message. It wasn't particularly odd, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I got up to make some tea, hoping it would calm my nerves. As I set the kettle on, my eyes fell on her work badge sitting by the kitchen counter. It was always there, her little routine of leaving it by the same spot every day. But if she was at the office, and if entry to her building was controlled by badges, how had she gotten in? I considered calling her again but decided against it. I was tired, my thoughts were muddled, and I knew pressing her now would only lead to an argument. Instead, I told myself I'd ask her in the morning, once we were both rested and clear-headed. When she arrived home around sunrise, she looked exhausted but oddly composed. I waited until she had settled in before asking the question that had been bothering me all night. "How did you get into the office without your badge?" She blinked, as if caught off guard by the question, then let out a short laugh. "Are you serious?" "My friend gave me her badge. That way, the system would clock her in, and she wouldn't lose her shift credit." She even showed me a text exchange with her friend, a straightforward conversation where the friend had asked her to swing by and pick up her badge earlier that day. It seemed plausible, but something still lingered. As she moved past me, I caught a faint scent, cheap cologne, sharp and overwhelming. It wasn't hers, and it wasn't something I'd smelled in our home before. I asked about it directly. Her response was immediate but defensive. "Oh, God, don't start. Something weird happened last night." She then launched into an explanation about the IT guy. Apparently, when the server went down, he came over to her desk and started chatting. According to her, he was awkward, desperate even. He told her he had no luck with women and asked her for advice on relationships. She said he was wearing an absurd amount of cologne, and when he got emotional, teary-eyed, even, she had lightly patted him on the shoulder to comfort him. The way she told the story, it sounded plausible enough. Awkward men with poor social skills exist in every office, and it wouldn't be unheard of for someone in a stressful night shift to overshare or act out emotionally. Still, something gnawed at me. She even showed me a message from the guy. It was a short apology, "Sorry if I was weird last night. Thanks for the advice. You're really kind." It was innocuous, even pathetic in its simplicity. She hadn't replied to it. I nodded slowly, feeling a little foolish for pressing the issue so hard. Her explanation ticked every box, it was logical, detailed, and supported by evidence. Still, there was something intangible, something that didn't quite sit right. We finished breakfast in near silence. She mentioned her packed schedule for the coming week, listing meetings, errands, and appointments she needed to handle. Then she looked at me for a moment, her brow slightly furrowed. "You've been acting strange lately," she said. "It's like you're seeing things that aren't there. Are you okay?" I shrugged and said, "Maybe." But inside, I knew one thing for certain, something wasn't adding up. The cologne, the badge, the IT guy's strange behavior. None of it outright contradicted her story, but none of it fully aligned either. As she cleared the table and started her day, I told myself I'd pay more attention moving forward. The details, the little things, they were starting to tell a story of their own. And I intended to listen. About a week had passed since the night shift incident, and curiosity started eating at me. My wife had mentioned that her friend promised her some kind of special gift for covering that shift. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it was starting to gnaw at the back of my mind. One evening, while we were having dinner, I decided to ask her outright about it. She shrugged and said she wasn't sure yet, but that her friend had hinted at something exciting. The next day, I came home from work, and my wife practically jumped into my arms, squealing with excitement. Apparently, the long-awaited gift had been revealed. Her friend had managed to get her a certificate for yoga sessions with some famous instructor who had just arrived from India. According to her, he was practically a guru, with generations of yoga tradition flowing through his veins. She gushed about his experience and the opportunity to learn from someone so authentic. She also made it clear that she wanted me to join her at some point. She said it would do me good, that I'd been getting soft around the middle, and that a little movement wouldn't kill me. I played along, nodded, and asked when she planned to start. "Tomorrow," she exclaimed with a big smile. She spent the rest of the evening preparing her gym bag, laying out a new yoga mat, and trying on different combinations of athletic wear. The following day, she dressed in tight leggings and a sporty top, grabbed her mat, and headed out. It became a routine. Every day, she would leave at the same time, dressed in her yoga outfit, and return hours later, looking refreshed and cheerful. She even demonstrated a few yoga poses in our living room, talking about how much better she felt and how this was already improving her life. At first, I bought into it. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and everything seemed to check out. But after 2 weeks of this routine, something happened that cracked the facade. I was scrolling through Instagram one morning after she had left for her session, and I noticed a post from the yoga studio she attended. They announced that the studio would be closed for several days due to technical issues. My first thought was practical, maybe she hadn't checked their social media before heading out. Maybe she'd find out when she arrived and come straight home. But an hour passed. Then 2. She didn't return. When she finally came back, she walked in with her usual bright smile, chatting away about how amazing the session had been and how the breathing exercises were practically life-changing. I waited until she finished her story before asking, as casually as possible, "So, how was the session if the studio was closed?" She paused only for a second before launching into an explanation. Apparently, the closure hadn't stopped them from practicing. According to her, a group of students and the instructor decided to relocate the session to a nearby children's playground. It was, she said, an improvised but effective solution. Her story was smooth, too smooth. I watched her carefully as she explained how the playground setting added a new element of challenge and how they all laughed about it afterward over coffee. She even pulled out her phone and showed me some photos and videos from the supposed outdoor session. Her friend had apparently filmed snippets of the training. Everything lined up. The photos looked real, the videos seemed candid, and her explanation made sense. But there was something about the way she spoke, the casual confidence in her voice, that felt rehearsed. Not overly so, but just enough to plant a seed of doubt in my mind. It wasn't even about what she said, it was about how she said it. There was no hesitation, no sign of her being caught off guard. If anything, she seemed overly prepared, as if she had run through the scenario in her head multiple times. It was polished, airtight, and frustratingly believable. I realized then that confronting her directly wasn't going to work. Every time I asked a question, she had an answer ready, often with photographic evidence to back it up. If I wanted to get to the truth, I needed to change tactics. Pushing her would only make her more careful, more guarded. No, I needed her to lower her defenses. I decided to play the fool. My plan was simple: stop asking questions, stop showing concern, and start acting like I didn't care. I'd let her believe that I was checked out, distracted, or just plain oblivious. If she thought I wasn't paying attention, she might start slipping up. To sell it, I started being intentionally careless. I'd leave dishes in the sink, forget to take out the trash, and let little tasks around the house pile up. I stopped asking her about her day in any detail and began responding to her stories with absent-minded nods or vague comments. At first, she seemed a little annoyed. She'd huff and roll her eyes when I forgot something or brushed off one of her yoga stories. But eventually, she started to relax. She stopped being as guarded with her explanations, and her usual polish started to fade just slightly. I noticed small inconsistencies in her stories, little details that didn't quite add up. It was working. The more relaxed she became, the more confident I felt in my approach. I couldn't put my finger on it yet, but I was certain something wasn't right. And sooner or later, she'd slip up. My goal wasn't to confront her head-on or accuse her without evidence. That would only drive her further into secrecy. No, I was going to be patient. I'd keep up the act, keep her thinking I wasn't paying attention, and when the moment was right, when the cracks in her story became too big to ignore, I'd be ready. In my mind, the plan was solid. If she felt safe, if she believed I was no longer suspicious, she'd let her guard down completely. And when that happened, I'd finally have my answers. I started staying late at work more frequently. Whenever my wife asked about it, I'd sigh heavily and tell her that I was giving her space because I realized I'd been too controlling. Honestly, I was starting to irritate myself with this act, but I could see it working. The colder and more detached I became, the more it seemed to push her into a space where she felt free, too free, perhaps. She became bolder in her criticisms of me, pointing out things she didn't like about our relationship and how I'd changed. While she continued going to her so-called yoga sessions, I began spending more evenings with friends. I made sure to seem carefree, relaxed, and as if I didn't have a care in the world. During one of these evenings, I shared the details of the situation with my friends. We talked openly, and eventually, we came up with a strategy, a different approach to shake things up. I invited some of these friends over to our home for a casual gathering. Importantly, these were the single friends, the ones who knew how to flirt and weren't afraid to do so. Before they arrived, I told them to compliment my wife openly, to pay her attention, and to act as if I wasn't even there. Meanwhile, I would remain utterly indifferent, almost dismissive. The evening played out exactly as planned. My friends laid it on thick with their compliments, and I made sure not to react. I kept my face neutral, my responses short, and my attention elsewhere. I could see the confusion growing in her eyes as the night went on. When the guests finally left, she wasted no time. She told me we needed to talk, seriously. I agreed without hesitation. She let loose, saying she wanted attention from me, not from my friends. She said I had become distant, weak, and unengaged, and she didn't recognize me anymore. I listened, nodding occasionally, but inside, I knew I had struck exactly where I wanted to. The cracks were showing, and her carefully maintained facade was beginning to crumble. After that conversation, things started to shift. She grew sloppier with her stories, her excuses became inconsistent, and most importantly, she didn't seem to realize it herself. She was unraveling, and I was watching it all happen in real time. That's when I decided to set the next phase of my plan in motion. I told her, offhandedly over dinner one evening, that I'd been assigned a week-long business trip. She barely reacted. She sighed and said something about being alone again, about how she'd be like a woman without a husband. I gave her a guilty look and said it was unavoidable. She brushed it off with a shrug, and I knew right then that she was planning something. The night before my supposed departure, I packed a small suitcase and made sure to leave it in plain sight. I kissed her goodbye in the morning, got in my car, and drove away. But I didn't go far. Instead, I stayed with one of my closest friends. Over drinks that evening, I shared the next phase of my plan. My friend leaned back in his chair, grinning. "You should come back early," he said. "Catch her off guard. And when you confront her, don't yell, don't accuse, just act defeated, like you've already given up. Make her think you're too weak to fight back." It was a brilliant idea. I spent 2 days away, keeping in touch with her through casual texts and short calls. She sounded normal, cheerful even. But I could tell something was off. On the third day, I packed up my things and drove home without warning. When I walked through the door, she froze. "You're back early," she said, her voice tight. I didn't respond directly. Instead, I slumped onto the couch, let out a deep sigh, and mumbled something about being tired and miserable. Then, in the same breath, I started asking, quietly, almost pitifully, about her outings, her yoga classes, and her late returns. She snapped almost immediately. "Why are you acting like this? Are you spying on me? What's wrong with you?" she said, her voice rising with every word. I didn't raise my voice. I stayed slouched, staring at the floor, muttering about feeling pathetic and confused. And that's when she lost it. She stormed off to the bedroom, yanking open drawers and pulling out clothes. She grabbed her makeup bag, her purse, and began getting ready in front of the mirror with furious determination. She was applying lipstick with sharp, aggressive strokes, her hands trembling slightly. "Where are you going?" I asked softly, keeping my voice low and unthreatening. "Somewhere I'm appreciated," she snapped, glaring at me through the mirror. I nodded slowly, pretending to process her words as if they had shattered what little self-esteem I had left. Inside, though, I was smirking. The act was working beautifully. She finished getting ready, grabbed her bag, and stormed out the door, slamming it shut behind her. I sat there on the couch for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. I had played my role perfectly, the image of a broken, weak man who had been pushed too far. And it had worked. Her reaction told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't guilt. This wasn't remorse. This was frustration and panic. As the sound of her car faded into the distance, I leaned back against the couch and let out a slow breath. I had used the illusion of weakness to break through her defenses, to shake her carefully maintained composure. And in that moment, I knew this was the beginning of the end. The moment of reckoning arrived on a cold, grey morning. She stumbled into the house at dawn, the smell of alcohol heavy in the air. Her makeup was smeared, her hair disheveled, and her eyes bloodshot. She barely managed to kick off her heels before shouting something incoherent in my direction. Then, with venom in her voice, she said the words that would set everything into motion: "Go fetch my underwear from my lover. He'll teach you how to please me properly." Her words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. I stared at her, my expression carefully neutral. Inside, though, I was seething. But I kept my act together. I nodded slowly, muttered a soft, "All right, give me the address," and waited. She spat out an address between drunken hiccups, and I calmly grabbed my keys and walked out the door. The moment I was outside, I pulled out my phone and started dialing. 4 of my closest friends picked up within minutes. They didn't ask many questions, they just listened, understood, and agreed to meet me immediately. It wasn't long before we were packed into my car, driving through empty streets toward the address she had given me. We pulled up to a modest apartment building in a rundown part of town. The building looked tired, its paint peeling, windows fogged with grime. My fists clenched as I walked up to the door and knocked. After a few seconds, it creaked open, and there he was, the yoga instructor, the so-called spiritual guide from India. His eyes widened when he saw me and the group of men standing behind me. We stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The air was thick with cheap incense, and scattered yoga mats covered the floor. My friend spread out, silently blocking any escape route. I stood in front of him, staring him down until he looked away. "Start talking," I said. "All of it. Every secret, every lie, every scheme." His face crumpled almost immediately. The man started sobbing, his shoulders shaking as he begged for mercy. He mumbled something about returning money, about making things right. That's when it clicked. Money? Why was he talking about money? I leaned closer, my voice low and steady. "What money are you talking about?" Through choked sobs, he confessed. His entire yoga enterprise was a scam. He had been taking money from students under false pretenses, promising enlightenment and exclusive sessions with ancestral wisdom that he never actually provided. It was all an act, a lucrative act. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I made him repeat every word, every confession, every dirty detail about his scam. The more he spoke, the clearer my new plan became. Once I had enough evidence recorded, I shifted gears. "Now, tell me about my wife." He hesitated, glancing at my friends, but one sharp look from me was enough to make him start talking again. He admitted to the affair, every detail, every lie, every alibi they had concocted together. Then, as if to make it all worse, he offered me access to videos and text exchanges. I took them all. Every damning piece of evidence was now in my possession. By the time he was done talking, there was nothing left to say. My phone was full of confessions and incriminating files. I let silence hang in the air for a moment before delivering one sharp punch across his jaw. He stumbled back, clutching his face, but nobody moved to help him. We dragged him outside, tossed him into the back seat of my car, and drove to the edge of a nearby forest. The place was isolated, quiet, no witnesses, no interruptions. We pulled him out and left him by the side of an old dirt road. He was still sniffling and mumbling apologies as we got back into the car. From the passenger seat, I dialed the police. I kept my voice steady, professional, as I reported a known scam artist operating fraudulent businesses in our city. I forwarded every recording, every piece of evidence I had. Before I even finished speaking, they confirmed that an investigation would be launched immediately. Satisfied, we drove back home. My friends left one by one, their roles in this drama complete. I walked into the house to find my wife sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Her eyes lifted briefly when she saw me, and her expression turned sour. I pulled something out of my jacket pocket and tossed it onto the coffee table. Her underwear, the very item she had mockingly told me to fetch. It landed with a dull sound, and she recoiled slightly, her face twisting with anger and shame. Without saying a word, she got up and stormed upstairs. I heard the bedroom door slam shut, but I didn't follow her. I simply sat down on the couch and exhaled, feeling the weight of the night lift slightly from my shoulders. But the night wasn't over. I picked up my phone again, this time to call my lawyer. I told him I wanted a divorce, effective immediately. He didn't ask for details, he simply said, understood, and promised to start the paperwork. I leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling. Everything was in motion now, the police investigation, the divorce, and the crumbling facade of my wife's perfect little world. There was one final piece left to play, my revenge against her. It had to be precise, calculated, and final. She had no idea what was coming. And as I sat there in the darkened living room, I couldn't help but smile slightly. The endgame had begun, and she was entirely unprepared. As the divorce papers were being finalized, I shifted my behavior entirely. I became calm, almost serene, but every interaction with her carried a faint edge of something she couldn't quite place, something sharp and unsettling. I would drop comments here and there, offhandedly asking her why her lover hadn't been in touch. Strange, isn't it? No calls, no messages? Doesn't that seem odd to you? Each time, her face would pale, her lips would tighten, and she'd try to brush it off. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew. One evening, after dinner, I brought it up again. Any news from your yoga guru lately? He seems unusually quiet. Her fork clattered against her plate. Her eyes widened, and for the briefest moment, I saw pure fear flash across her face. Why are you saying that? What do you mean? She stammered. I shrugged and said it was just a hunch, just idle speculation. But I let the silence hang heavy between us, letting her stew in her own imagination. The tension built with every passing day. She grew jumpy, irritable, and paranoid. My casual remarks became invisible strings pulling her closer to the inevitable breakdown. I could see it in her eyes every time I spoke, she was terrified of what I might know. Eventually, the weight of it all became too much, and she snapped. What did you do to him? She screamed at me one night, her voice breaking with raw panic. I kept my face blank, feigning innocence. Do to whom? I have no idea what you're talking about. Her hands trembled, her breath came in short, uneven gasps, but I gave her nothing. No answers, no explanations, just silence and an unreadable expression. When the divorce papers finally arrived, I took the envelope and walked calmly into the living room. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone with unfocused eyes. I placed the envelope on the coffee table in front of her and said, "It's time." She froze. Her eyes darted to the papers, then back to me. Slowly, she picked up the envelope with trembling hands and opened it. The realization washed over her like a cold wave, and her face crumpled as the tears began to fall. For a few moments, she sat there sobbing, clutching the papers as if they were the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. But I wasn't done yet. Do you know where your lover is right now? I asked, my voice calm and measured. She looked up at me, her mascara running down her cheeks, and whispered, "No. I don't know." I leaned slightly closer, letting my words land like a hammer. He's in prison. And do you know why he's there? Her sobs turned into wails. She buried her face in her hands, shaking uncontrollably. I stood there for a moment, watching the mess she had become, before I turned and started gathering her belongings. Piece by piece, I began packing her clothes, shoes, makeup, all the little fragments of her life that had once filled our home. With every item I picked up, I felt lighter. Some things I threw directly onto the lawn outside, letting them scatter in the cold night air. Others, I left neatly stacked by the door. She was still crying as I pulled her suitcase down the stairs. She didn't try to stop me. She didn't say a word. When I opened the front door and gestured for her to leave, she hesitated for just a moment before stepping out into the night. The door closed behind her with a finality that echoed through the empty hallway. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. It was over, or at least, the worst of it was. The next chapter played out in the cold, sterile confines of a courtroom. She tried to play the victim, weaving stories about misunderstandings and regrets. But the evidence I had, the recordings, the photos, the confessions, spoke louder than any of her words. The judge's decision came swiftly. I won. The house, the assets, everything was settled in my favor. She left the courtroom with her head hanging low, her face drained of color. She avoided my gaze as she walked past me, clutching her purse like it was a lifeline. After the dust settled, I wasted no time. I sold the house, a place that had once been our home but had turned into a mausoleum of broken trust and betrayal. With the money from the sale, I bought a smaller house in a quieter neighborhood, far away from the places that held memories of her. Moving day felt cathartic. Each box I carried into my new home felt like shedding a layer of dead skin. I painted the walls, replaced the furniture, and filled the space with things that were mine and mine alone. I spent my first night in the new house sitting on the back porch with a drink in my hand, staring up at the sky. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt at peace. The weight of suspicion, deceit, and manipulation had finally lifted. The road to this point had been long, dark, and filled with traps, but I had made it through. I wasn't naive enough to believe that everything would magically fall into place now, but it was a start. There was just one final thread left dangling, Iha. The last piece of the puzzle was my revenge, and it was something she would never see coming. But for now, under the faint glow of distant stars, I allowed myself a moment of quiet victory. The war was over, but the final battle was still to come.